So hi, Maureen.
Hi, Lee.
I'm so happy to have you on Think About It today to talk about Wordsworth.
Glad to be here.
So, you know, I have been rereading Wordsworth, who's known to us as one of the great British Romantic poets. One of the poets most school kids are kind of afflicted by, have to read the daffodils and not incomprehendingly sit there and think, what is this about and why is he such an important figure?
Right.
So I thought I'd read a few lines from one of your poems,
Sure.
from this beautiful book, Mrs. N, the serial, and there's a Wordsworth passage in here. You have a couple of Wordsworth passages,
Yeah.
I think, that are more hidden or tucked away or kind of
Exactly.
secreted.
Yeah.
And I'll start reading this to you so you'll hear your own words.
In your voice, this is
In
going to
my
be
words,
interesting.
exactly. Wordsworth never took a plane, but Miss N takes a plane with Wordsworth on her mind and other matters, love, fear, a wish to die. Wordsworth had a very sturdy mind and legs that took him far into the mountains, Scottish glens, German towns, and yes, across the Alps. Miss N has never seen the Alps, nor Snowdon, nor a mountain anywhere beyond the ancient Adirondacks. Wordsworth, too, she thinks, would like their worn-down humps, their pathless woods, their rowboats by the shores of placid lakes ready for exploring. Young Wordsworth stole a rowboat, rowed out on the lake one night and found himself appalled. The mountain strode sublime after him, and he trembled in his mind, as Burke had said it would, before sublimity near failed. There are passages in life, in Wordsworth, he called spots of time. And Miss N has some spots she sometimes recollects, but now she's happy and credulous in love, and in strange anguish wants to recollect nothing. If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she murmurs with the engine nearly exploding, with the fragility and perverse strength of all that lives and moves and has its being in the air, on the ground, in the sea. Having reached a floating state of grace, surprised by joy, she wants to die. Life can only get worse, the mountain receding below them as they climb. So I love this passage for a very specific reason. What I found in this passage is this engagement with Wordsworth, where in this idea of spots of time or recollection or going back to a memory of childhood or an experience where you're so filled with the ecstasy of being alive and being part of your surroundings, actually drinking them in or they're traversing you, that Wordsworth becomes the poet who recollects. And I kind of want to ask you about that. You recollect in the big poems, Tintern Abbey, the Ode, or the Prelude, you recollect and you gain something. There's abundant recompense for recollecting your childhood immediacy. In this poem, you take this turn and you say, but now she's happy and credulous in love and in strange anguish wants to recollect nothing. And I thought this is a great way of going into Wordsworth, who proposes to us recollecting can resurrect this memory in us.
Well, it's there, as you said, there's a lot of Wordsworth both named in this passage and a lot of Wordsworth thinking about childhood and memory and composition and self-composition, and that has definitely traversed me and has become part of the logic of my mind. And he's so interesting in and significant, certainly in the history of poetries in English, for how much philosophical and poetic time he gave, both to childhood, but also to first impressions and immediacy in general. Mm-hmm. So that is one aspect of what he honors often in the work. But what's also there always is this second order sense of what comes back to the adult, or what is drawn upon in that moment of these memories that, or recollections that, as he puts it, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the breath of solitude. So these things that spontaneously come back to us. And he says somewhere in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, his first, in a way, big book, and he has a line about, he says, well, of course, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And most people might still think like, yeah, poetry, I'm moved,
Right.
I want to, poetry
Right.
is about self-expression, spontaneous overflow, but he does this other thing, and that's the Wordsworthian pivot. He says, yes, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. So there's always that, for him, second beat, which is poetry may present itself to you, a reader, as if it were the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But from Wordsworth's perspective, it's something that has been composed, recollected, recomposed, written down. He actually often composed while walking. So it's interesting to think about that, these sort of rhythms of walking and what came back to him. So I think that he has an extremely interesting theory of mind and composition and people as almost, you might almost say archaeological or geologic layers, but that would be too static an image, because one almost feels that what happens is we are suddenly shot through with feeling, illumination, memory, image, and these things become, as he says elsewhere, I think life and food for future years.
Right.
So
they fructify us or something.
absolutely,
they nourish, right?
They nourish us, and whether or not you agree with this, which I think is a highly arguable theory, I would say. It's fascinating in terms of the dignity it gives to childhood experiences, and it's fascinating in terms of it's being a theory of mind, and how the mind is recursive, and how at any moment things, people have the experience. They might be 60 and feel themselves just as they were when they were 4, or, and these sort of layers that might suddenly flash upon us and in us. So that's something that I take seriously in Wordsworth, and that the other thing that, or another thing that's really significant about him for me and for many people is that he writes this autobiographical epic, and that it's probably, I think it's probably the first autobiographical epic in verse in English, and it's.
So break this. This is the prelude.
And it's his poem.
Autobiographical. It's about his.
It's about himself. It's about his life story.
And it goes back to. It goes back to very early.
It goes back to childhood, pre-verbal.
Actually, pre-verbal memories.
Absolutely,
of him.
and what it was to be, a small boy in the Lake District in England, and stealing a rowboat and going.
Even before that, at his mother's breast,
yes.
There's this kind of amazing recollection of things that are pre-verbal, maybe pre-symbolic. Yeah. And when you say it's one of the first autobiographical epics, in some ways, how does this happen? That someone could start thinking about himself in this way as material for poetry, and until then, what had people written about?
I mean, it is. I was thinking about it walking over here. There's a way in which he's such a kind of official institutional poet, and particularly in Britain, but probably in the U.S., he still shows up in syllabi. And even if people don't read Wordsworth, they've heard of Wordsworth. And one of the things, I mean, he definitely has an incredibly boring, serious aura. And he may well deserve that. His own contemporaries said that about him, too. I think that's part of the, as it were, problem of Wordsworth. Right. But what's amazing is that for all of his high seriousness, he's also a poet of joy. But
that's what I kind of find interesting. You said he's serious. He is an institution because he is the first poet to do something for us, which is for us meaning he gives us ourselves as material for reflection, and reflection to cover everything we've become, to go back to who we were, to know who we are today, and reflecting. So this epic unfolds as the story of his mind and of his life,
which is a deeply, deeply weird project in 1800.
Right.
For us now, I mean, if most people think
That's
about
all we do, actually.
Right.
That's
if most people now think of, if you say to somebody you're a poet, they assume that you're writing about your personal experience.
I actually think when people say, "Who are you?" they say, "Where'd you grow up? Who are your parents? What do you do?
What do you do?
Remember? What do you do in New York and where do you live?"
That's exactly.
But actually, that we make sense of ourselves comprehensively, reaching back into childhood, saying, "I had this experience, therefore I am that today." This has become the mode of how we think about ourselves.
And it's probably no accident that, say, post-psychoanalysis, somebody like Wordsworth, I mean, that turn to the child and the family and these significant early events, that the way they might resonate throughout one's life, he becomes an ongoing kind of resource.
Was this not a kind of commonplace around 1800 that people
No.
thought your childhood experience may determine how you behave today.
And also there was just a much stronger class determination, particularly in Britain. I mean, the sense that you would dilate hundreds and hundreds of lines, thousands of lines on childhood experience would seem self-indulgent and ludicrous. And it's not an accident that Wordsworth did not publish the Prelude in his lifetime. It's a posthumous thing. And what he was most famous in his lifetime for poems like his poems Lyrical Ballads, these short lyrics which are often extremely beautiful, but there are also a number of poems that are about social life and meeting peasants on the road or meeting old rustics. And that part of Wordsworth gets forgotten because people tend to think of Wordsworth as the poet of what Keats said, the egotistical sublime. He's Mr. Ego, and in the US, we have Whitman, who's our Mr. Ego. So it's an interesting comparison. But to think of, in a way, the originality of the task Wordsworth set himself, he, throughout this poem, The Prelude, that comes to be known as The Prelude, he's modeling himself on Milton. And if you think Milton wrote an epic on, to justify the ways of God to man, if you think, Homer composes epics on, the journeys of, Odysseus and the Trojan War, this is a striking, peculiar, and deeply modern turn, right? This sort of inward turn that Wordsworth is part of. And in a certain key, you see this with some of his contemporaries. I mean, Byron writes long poems with Byronic heroes in them. But that sense of really taking personal experience seriously and philosophically, and also that whatever the specifics of your experience are, they could be generalized. That's the other thing that's interesting about Wordsworth, because he both seems like a crazy, self-absorbed, you could say, as some contemporaries did. He was a crazily self-absorbed person, and how can you devote a poetry to this? You could also say that he understood his childhood as allegorical material, that anybody would have an analogous childhood and could think about their lives in a certain way. And
when you said earlier he starts in feeling, which I found really interesting. It sort of actually originates in feeling. It goes to this other part, you said in Lyrical Ballads, where he's very connected to other people. And a lot of it is how to connect with other people. Sort of how to hear this still sad song of humanity. There's this other part. The other part, but at the same time, the Wordsworth we've received is a somewhat staid and formal person,
hyper-regulated,
which
very
he isn't
boring.
Actually once you read it. He actually isn't. It's like most poets who become canonized, they sort of get put into a space and they say they do something for
they become a monument.
As if the tradition really just absorbs them in a kind of, they're put in a box and there they are. But the feeling part is really interesting, that you said his childhood can become a model for other people how to think about their childhood. But it's not, they're not going to have the same experiences. They're not going to have the same feelings. But how to even make sense of a feeling you once had and you're looking back at it, which is what I like this in your poem here in this book, that you kind of set this up and you're kind of rowing with Wordsworth out into the lake and there's a kind of sublimity in their passages in life. And then you say, but now she's happy, incredulous in love. And I like something in this line, she's happy, incredulous in love. There's no line break. Because the happiness is something she can't understand. There's an incredulity about happiness, about feeling, which I think Wordsworth keeps on bringing us back to a feeling and says, this is the feeling I was in. Now I can look back at it. And it's not progress, it's not chronology, it's not psychoanalysis, which tries to unlock the mysteries of childhood and say, this is the key to us. It says, there's that feeling, this is what I felt, here I am now. So psychoanalysis will do something very different with childhood memory, which are mostly locked in some kind of...
and there's almost, as it were, the kind of, detective, novel logic of, and there's some, Wordsworth is up to something else. And I think that, his sense too that poetry and any art begins in the sensations of the body and the feelings of the body. And he's, by reputation, he's the least the least sexy of poets, right? He's the most...
He's not Shelley, who dies on the beach.
He's not Shelley, he's not Byron, he's not Keats. No one's going to go make a biopic. I mean, it would be interesting to see a biopic of Shelley, right? Yeah, so he doesn't...
so Coleridge is incredibly charismatic.
Exactly.
People adore Coleridge. What's Keats' attraction for the world?
Well, I mean, he's young, and he writes these beautiful winning letters, and you just feel the force of this unbelievably lovely, funny, smart, brilliant young man making himself in language and in friendship. And Wordsworth has a different sensibility, and in a way, when one often wants to read Wordsworth against his reception, because the reception is so like, oh my God, Wordsworth, and the fact is, that's partly a deserved reputation, but I also think there are just extraordinary passages, particularly in the first 10 years of his publishing life, between, say, 1797 and 1807. People talk about the miraculous decade, when he really kind of came into his own. He meets Coleridge. I mean, it's so much, the story of Wordsworth is so much a story of kindling friendship.
Which is remarkable. Yeah. They're actually working together.
They're working together. They're literally exchanging stanzas, composing together as they're walking through, the hills, and also with Dorothy.
Right.
So there's this community, this powerful young community of young radicals who are sympathetic to the recently disastrously concluded French Revolution.
But this is an important aspect in the prelude.
Huge.
The revolution, which is the hope of Europe.
Exactly.
They are in favor of it, then their hopes are dashed, but they somehow carry on.
And Wordsworth is a little, he's a tricky one politically, depending on what your persuasions are. I mean, he has 2 books in the prelude devoted to what he calls residence in France. He's over in France, and he hears about, the death of Robespierre, and he's being taken around, actually by a royalist officer, and is going there as a young Englishman who felt the brotherhood of man. And he was completely endorsing, fraternité, liberté, égalité. These were the virtues he too was espousing as a young man. Now he came to have a much more cautious relation to radicalism. So in a way, Wordsworth becomes this, for a lot of readers who go deep into Wordsworth, he becomes a kind of figure of disappointing liberalism. He becomes a figure sort of avant la lettre of a kind of neoconservative turn. Shelley called him a turncoat. He becomes a figure for his own younger contemporaries.
Shelley died so young
and Shelley dies very young.
We have no knowledge what Shelley would have.
Exactly. Shelley, I think, was 29.
Of course, there's a great romance in anybody who was a revolutionary.
Who dies young, exactly. And same with Byron. And many people have speculated. I mean, Byron probably would have ended up a very charismatic Tory.
But there's something, as you said, there's a kind of physical dimension in Wordsworth, which has to be glossed over for this story to really work.
Yes.
It's very interesting. It's very physical. And all of his memories are usually physical. He retrieves them or
he's rowing a boat, right? Or you get many, many passages of walking.
Yeah.
You get the other, as you said, you get this fascinating image of the babe suckling,
Right.
And he's also a really interesting open-air poet. There's a lot of, the prelude begins, there is blessing in this gentle breeze, right? So this idea that it's a poetry of the outdoors, and there's a reason why he has been significant for people who are interested in environmental readings and ecological readings of Romanticism. Really, he's the kind of figure, both because of the richness of the work and because of 200 plus years of reception, he's the kind of figure who can be activated for almost any reading and position. So in a way, I often feel like I want to, if I'm talking about him with students or with friends or with myself, I kind of want to reactivate the feeling sensing Wordsworth.
And I felt like what you activated in this one passage, which is an obvious one because it mentions Wordsworth in a particular plane, what you wanted to activate is this duality, not tension, but productive tension, that there is, we want to be in the moment, and we also look back at every moment. And of course, all poetry is always tries to grasp the moment, but Wordsworth has a way of doing that without this kind of melancholic loss. We once lived fully, but now I look back at this, and I'm no longer young. or the kind of ecstatic, I'm going to lose myself to the moment and try to recreate it in the poem, and end up giving you what Jeffrey Hartman, one of my teachers, called a kind of false immediacy.
Yes.
And so he's constantly dealing with mediation, that I can't get to my own experience, of course, because the mind intervenes.
Yes.
And language intervenes, but it's not a problem in a way. So I thought you activated this part to say, yeah, there's tension, but this tension can be opened up rather than we have to resolve it for either the past ecstatic memory, the experience, and today's memory of it.
I think that is just really astute, and I think that is the kind of thing that he dramatizes again and again in some of the big famous poems, like the Ode Intimations on Immortality, where that sense of the joys of childhood, they may have fallen away partly through education, partly through just the accretion of experience. But he transforms that. It isn't this sort of tragedy, melancholy of adulthood. It is a higher order pleasure. He wants to give it to us as a simultaneity.
This was my big question reading this week. So in the Intimations Ode, in Tintern Abbey, there's a first pass, they're different, so the structures are different. So in the Ode, there's 4 stanzas where he is this child, everything was given to him.
Right.
He was able to experience the world.
Right.
And then he didn't write the next part for quite a long time, right? There's a couple of years break, and then the next part, like, we are kind of asleep to the world in this kind of platonic way. We're in a cave, we'll never get access to the world again. And this is what I was trying to figure out, and that's what I really wanted to ask you. Is that satisfying to say there is this abundant recompense in older age where we look back at our childhood or our youthful kind of ecstasies? Because there seems to be some openness to this. In Tintern Abbey also he says, I look back on this, I was here 5 years ago, now I look again at the banks of the Wye, and it sort of gives me what I couldn't have gotten because now my mind has grown and matured.
Right. I mean, do I think Wordsworth's sense of compensations is satisfying? Not 100%. Do I think that he is a kind of genius of dramatizing the movements of self and mind and time, and that sense, the Intimations Ode begins, there was a time when the earth and every common scene to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the vision and the glory of a dream. I'm kind of dragging various phrases. So you get this vision, and then he says, it is not now as it hath been of yore. So the thing I'm really interested in him too is the way his poems hold time. Right. So there's, so it's a sort of like self-diagnostic moment. There was a time, it is not now as it hath been of yore. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is it been? The glory and the dream. Where is it now? The glory and the dream. And that sense of disappointed hopes, things that have come crashing down upon you in adulthood, whether you understand that as failures of relationships, the failures of the French Revolution.
I know.
And then he does this move, and how one thinks about this move probably has to do with our own temperaments. He, as you said, he put aside the poem after the initial 4 stanzas where he got to this crux. Whither has gone the glory and the dream? Whither has gone all of those upsurges of joy and that capacity for rich and positive feeling? And it sits for a couple of years. And when he returns to this more general myth of our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Right. The idea of, all of us pre-exist our birth and come into the world. And in a way, this is where you could see...
Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. So the birth coming into life is actually entering, or is a sleep
is
and
a
forgetting.
Kind
There's
of...
something prior.
Exactly. And there's a kind of fascinating way in which the baby itself is coming with all of this capacity for the new, with all of this, I mean, he's secularizing a lot of Christian aura, but that sense of this myth, right? That kind of blissful holiness that babies are born with, it starts to dim, and yet we still have access to it when we hear the mighty waters of the sea, when we suddenly, come upon a field. Maybe for some of us it would be when we saw an astonishing skyscraper, right? What would it be that would kind of reconnect us with this immanence?
Well, in your poem it's very clear.
Yeah.
You say no. You don't say but now she's happy, incredulous, and loved. You're not seeing a skyscraper, I think.
Right.
In
Yeah,
this poem. It's love. It's another
not
person.
right.
It's actually what's interesting, what you said earlier,
Yeah.
when Wordsworth connects with people.
Yes.
There is something there. So the question of, is there enough recompense? So he says in this ode, "O joy that in our embers is something that doth live." Something in us, as it were, knows more than what we know when we mature and gain knowledge. And
I think that's a wonderful and very Wordsworthian formulation.
But it's unclear that we know more because it's in our embers and we have to kindle it, and the poem kind of kindles it or fans this flame.
Yeah.
It's not. It's in our embers. It's not a flame, really.
Right.
And I read what you described earlier in the first four stanzas, and then "Our birth is but a slumber," and that it's also a story of what the Enlightenment gives us.
Yes.
Whether knowledge will actually liberate us and make
Right.
us free, which is Freud's big question about civilization.
Right.
He said we end up less happy. How
Right.
strange is that? And actually,
Right.
Wordsworth doesn't settle there. He says, actually, what we learn that something in us can be activated. This capacity, and there's this enormous capacity in him when you go, in the poems that go from this younger to older age.
Right.
In older age, he has this amazing capacity for joy.
And he does this interesting thing, this sort of transvaluation of what you might have thought was a disappointment. So towards the end
Right.
of the Intimations Ode, he says, not for these early wonderful things do I raise thoughts, thanksgiving and praise, but for those blank misgivings, for all the obstacles that we face as sentient beings when we are adults. I want to praise those things, he says. Now, whether I think that's the way to go,
do you
obviously.
That? I mean, do the blank misgivings. What could that mean for us?
I mean, I think there's a kind of power. Well, to go back to your earlier question, I think that the category of happiness isn't one that necessarily resonates with him as much. He does write a lot about pleasure, but when Wordsworth writes about pleasure, it often doesn't sound so much like pleasure. But he also does talk about, quote, a wise passiveness and a kind of wisdom. So again, I think that, Wordsworth is carrying some heavy water for, or doing some heavy lifting on behalf of the complexity of human development, and wanting to keep alive, as you said, a duality or a productive tension between the immediacy and overwhelming force of passions, whether they be sexual passions or anger or joy,
political passions.
Yeah,
could be also
political
the revolutionary
absolutely.
passion, which he, as you said, he's already disillusioned, and he still writes about the revolution as the greatest moment. But he already knows it's not going to work out the way he wanted it to work out. So
he does this very interesting thing where he never fully disavows, and yet he slightly contains. And it's an interesting way to think about also meter, that it's a meter as a measuring, that there's a fascinating way in which there is this both and quality all the time with Wordsworth, both in terms of the content of the poems, but also the actual form of the poems. So I do think I think he's very interesting to think with, because he keeps alive a complexity that often, either say psychoanalysis might pathologize certain things or think or want us. His notion of being disabused is different, I believe, from a notion of a psychoanalytic notion of being disabused. I mean,
what's the notion of being disabused in psychoanalysis?
That knowledge is actually, not an unproblematic liberation, right? I mean, the future of an illusion, right? The Enlightenment, creates its own structures of illusion, and I do think there's something incredibly moving if you read, say, Wordsworth's essays on epitaphs. I mean, people really struggling to think about the afterlife, really struggling to think about the relationship among generations, really trying to think about futurity. I also think, and this is something that can kind of fall by the boards, but Wordsworth is committed, at least in theory, to the notion of a poetry of, quote, common life, and a poetry in common language. He writes powerfully against poetic diction, against highfalutin, language. And so while he might sound, to contemporary American ears, for example, formal and a little stuffy, he actually is writing what in that period would have been a kind of regularized literary standard English, a kind of common idiom.
So what would he sound like in American English today? What kind of
I mean, it's an
language is
interesting
this?
thing because I actually think there's an argument to be made about Wordsworth to Whitman, not in the sense of influence, but in the sense of if democratic modernity means art should be able to carry the experiences and the hopes and the common language of a community, then I think there's something. Wordsworth doesn't always do it, but that's what he says poetry should be doing. Right. Because he has this idea of the poet as both special and typical. So he says a poet is a man, the work of poetry is a man speaking to men. It's not a higher, inspired Vatic. He's like, the poet is a man speaking to men.
It's not the Vatic role of the prophetic, the one who's touched by the muse. So
even though you do get scenes of that in his work, but it's a really powerful democratic gauntlet he throws down, that a poet is a man speaking. Of course, it's hypergendered, right? A man speaking to man. But if you polemically universalize that, I think there's a lot in common with the Whitmanian. I celebrate myself and sing myself and what I assume you shall assume, and that reciprocity. Now, Wordsworth goes on to say too that the poet is like any other person. We have the same bodies, the same sensoria. But the poet has a more than usual organic sensibility. So he wants to say the poet is both like everyone else and yet has slightly more vibrating nerve endings.
When you bring up Whitman, I want to ask you something. So Whitman also sings America into existence as this kind of polyglot, multivocal, diverse place to a point, right? Wordsworth is both a very, very British poet, but at the same time, what you just English. Okay, sorry. What you just
in the moment of Brexit.
All right.
Although he does talk a lot about Britain and Britannia, so we could actually talk about that.
But what you just described is actually that he's opening up poetry to a more general humanity.
100%.
Because it's not classed, because he looks at beggars and vagrants. Here in book 7 of the Prelude, he's in the city. It's this overwhelming canvas of humanity. Really interestingly, super global and diverse. It's actually like one of Rilke's elegies where he goes to the circus and there's all the attractions and it's kind of a circus and atmosphere. Yeah. But this idea that he's opening up to a more generalized humanity versus to an English humanity. Because I wonder whether because American school kids have to read Daffodils, and not only Americans. People in Jamaica, people in India.
Oh, exactly.
And I've
that famous thing with Jamaica Kincaid, which talking about, basically what the fuck is a daffodil, right? I've never, we don't have winter in Jamaica. These are not flowers of our climate.
The last autumnal crocus down, and I thought, it must become winter now because there's some type of crocus that blooms in the fall. So she said, I was taught, and I knew more about the daffodils than any British kid. But I wasn't in England, so the climate didn't quite work. So is it a more universal, general humanity he's talking to, or is it the one that you want to stay? You want to stay in Cambridge and book 2 of the Prelude?
Exactly, right. I mean, I would maybe slightly reformulate the question, which is what he says poetry should do, or his hopes for poetry, is that it might be universalizable. Yeah. Or, to, as he says elsewhere, to extend the domain of human sympathy, right? And that, so he talks a lot about, humans and common life. In actuality, of course, he's drawing on a very particular national, classed, hierarchized landscape and experience. I think that is a diagnostic tension. I think that tells us a lot more about the complexities of modernity than it does about whether Wordsworth should be kind of thrown off the bus or not.
Well, I'm also interested when you said there's the specific and then the general. Yeah. Would there be any poetry that is not rooted in the particularity of the speaking subject?
Well, exactly.
Because Wordsworth gives us poetry about himself, right? So
those ratios would be, I would say, different in a poet who traffics more in abstraction. I mean, again, there's never not going to be that oscillation. But if one thinks about somebody, say like Wallace Stevens or Fernando, Pessoa, or something, with the fact that this is another interesting aspect about Wordsworth, that he says the language of poetry should be no different from the language of prose, and that sense that the long poem, the prelude, the long autobiographical epic, it's full of narrative and stories,
Right.
and it shares a lot of commitments with a realist novel. You know, it's like, I was walking down this path. I was in Paris at this time. I heard about the death of Robespierre. I mean, you can date, you can place. There are real correlates. Whereas, and Whitman again also has social location and some specific correlates. But Wordsworth has a lot in the prelude. He has a lot of specific sites and locales, although they do get quite generalized in some of the odes, you know, the supposedly higher genres. So in the Immortality Ode, he says, there was a tree of many one, a field that I have looked upon. Both speak to me of something that is gone. Where's that tree? Where's that field? You know, he doesn't say there was an oak tree in Windermere. Right? He doesn't. So it's a very interesting thing about what feels hyperspecific and what feels more generalized. That sense of how Wordsworth travels or doesn't, and also how he was made to travel as part of an imperial curriculum, is fascinating.
And even what you just said, the line, there was a tree of many one. It's the quintessential outrageous gesture of poetry to posit something in the mind and say, there was a tree of many one. There was a field.
Tall tree in the ear.
Yeah, a tall tree in the ear is Rilke. It's also the tree of knowledge. It's the tree as a symbol of creation, of growth, of the human form. So all of these, there's a kind of symbolism behind it, but there's also not a symbolism that there's a tree, you're seeing it now.
Exactly.
And this is going to be the specific tree in my poem. I'm going to do something with it. So it sort of becomes a stand-in figure for, is it a specific tree?
Right.
Of course it's specific because it's the one he remembers.
Right.
And we all know what that means. We all have something remembered. It's specific to me. Part of what I'm going to try to do is to explain to you what that tree meant to me. And I'm not going to explain to you what that tree was.
Right.
So actually, it stood on this corner in this, or in that forest, or in this garden, or in this something. That's not so relevant. But say that tree was so meaningful to me.
Exactly.
So he teaches us that certain things become very relevant on a human level because they're so specific to one person. Because we invest things with meaning rather than they have a meaning because it stood on that corner, stood in that village.
That's such a good example of what he glosses in the Tintern poem, where he talks about things that we both
composed above. It's a very long title.
It's a very lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. It gets shortened as Tintern.
We're visiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July 13th, 1798, which I had to look up because everybody calls it Tintern Abbey.
Right? He had a lot of long titles. And he has some notion there. He talks about things, both what we half perceive and half create. And that's another aspect of thinking about how the mind works and how we make meaning for ourselves, and also how it becomes shareable with others.
But this part is very, Tintern Abbey is like as if someone is telling you something. What's weird about it, it's his mind and him revisiting a place he's been to 5 years ago. But when I reread all the poems, I thought someone is really trying to speak with someone else. They're actually strangely about himself and his own mind in this conversation, but as if he's trying to share and impart with you, which is unusual because there are lots of poets. I mean, Wallace Stevens, as you said, abstract. I'm not quite sure if Wallace Stevens is speaking to you or not.
Right.
He's speaking to, I don't quite know, but he's also speaking to him.
I mean, it makes me think too of the line of Yeats, that poetry is the argument with oneself, whereas rhetoric is the argument with others. And I think a really interesting thing with Wordsworth is that often, and as you say, when he is speaking, as it were, in propria persona and saying things about that we take as autobiographical about his own experience, he will also do this thing where he will turn to somebody else. And so, for example, in the prelude, the long story, it was also subtitled "The Growth of a Poet's Mind." So the idea too that autobiography isn't event.
The titling wasn't so good.
No, he needed a better marketer, right? The Growth of a Poet's Mind.
Leaves of Grass. It's
I know Leaves of Grass is much better.
Bad. Yeah, somehow.
But he does. He has all of these. Tales and apostrophes to the clouds and to the breeze. Right. But then he will turn and he'll say, thus I used to pour out my heart to you, O friend. And this poem is also known as the poem to Coleridge.
Right.
So he will turn in the middle of a passage and turn to Coleridge and address Coleridge directly. He also does this in shorter poems.
When that happens in a
Boy,
poem?
do I think one thing it does is it super wakes you up as a reader, and you realize that it also creates an implicit drama, right? A drama of either a mobile mind. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I'm walking around, there's always that stream of whatever's going on in your head and whatever you're hearing, and then you might think of a friend, or you might think of a parent or a child, and it sort of notes to them, and he builds that into the poem, and he does this amazing thing in Turn where you get all of his own feelings about returning to a place 5 years later and the change in his perception. Then he suddenly turns to his sister, and you, younger than I, are now in the first flush of all of your feelings, and so you are to me a second self. He says, carrying and experiencing what I did, at an earlier point of my life. And it's a very interesting move. He does a similar thing in lyrical ballads where he will include conversation. The poem, part of the matter of the poem is staged as a conversation with an old huntsman or an old man going to the seashore. So I think the fact the poems as social encounters often drops out in accounts of Wordsworth. Often people think that he's a poet of nature, he's a poet of childhood, he's out there addressing trees and birds, and it's like, that's not false, but he's also always out on the so-called public way.
Right.
He's always presenting himself as if, as walking on various roads, meeting vagrants, meeting people of other class positions. Now, this doesn't mean he's some radical Democrat proto-communist at all, but it does mean that he's interested in making poems out of complex social encounters. And one of the things I really like, or I feel like I've learned in thinking and reading, thinking about and reading Wordsworth, is that sense that inner and outer are permeable. It's not like there are poems of consciousness and poems of social encounter. They are in the same space for Wordsworth. And I think too often that gets amputated in our senses of literature and of poetry.
I remember reading the first lines of Tintern Abbey in a class with Jeffrey Hartman, actually, which is a nice way to remember him by. And I showed you, I have all those little notes there. And so the first few lines, and he taught me something there about poetry, what you just said, it opens up something with other people, it also opens up time. So the first lines are, 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And Hartman said, look, it's 5 years have passed. We know that means 5 summers and 5 winters, but the line opens up space and time for us. By saying 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters opens up the space of 5 long, as if we're now entering into time opening up. And Hartman said, this is what the poem can do. It opens up time.
Yes.
And it's not looking back at this lost moment. He said 5 years have passed, and then he says 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, obviously.
Right.
But there's nothing obvious that time can be opened up by us.
And the subjectivity of our perception of time. I mean, the incredible weirdness of the opening. I mean, the fact is, the poem is always present. 5 years have passed. Right now, 5 years have passed.
Right.
When you were reading with Jeffrey Hartman, right then, 5 years. So the time of the poem is imminent, right? So we're plunged into it. 5 years have passed with 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. That is a weird way that the poem keeps time.
And again, I hear, and you're sort of thinking, wait, where are we now?
Exactly.
5 years have passed from when? Again, something happening, I hear in the present.
Right now.
So he's opening up.
Exactly.
And what you said, we don't live in the present all the time, actually. I think Wordsworth does, in a good way. We're not melancholic and mournful for the past, but of course, what we're doing right now also makes us recollect, or it echoes certain things in the past. And that deepens it rather than weakens it. There's a sense in which my original question was, is there a loss because he doesn't have what his sister now has? This immediacy, the first time there, the first experience.
I think the poems acknowledge the loss. I think there is I think the poems are partly feeling out the loss, and also feeling out. He's a great poet of adverbs, and so you get a lot of the yet and the still, and it's like, what remains to me yet, even though those first glorious, unconscious attunements with nature and with pleasure
Right.
have fallen away. What remains to me yet? And so I think that the poems hold the complexity.
There's also a part where you just said unconscious attunements. I thought, well, that's a lot of syllables.
Sorry.
No, in a good way. And I thought, but a lot of it is also him recollecting all these terrible things he did, all these
It's
lawless
true.
things.
It's
and
true.
he sort of went kind of wild. He
Yeah.
was kind of a wild kid.
Yeah.
And there's something about the kind of violence or this kind of ruthlessness he had. So in some ways, he wasn't just attuned with nature, looking at how beautiful everything. He was very much of a boy's boy.
Oh yeah, and
he-
that whole thing about the kind of going hunting, stealing a
raiding the
boat,
nests.
raiding nests.
Nest and like birds, and he sort of
Yeah.
cheats basically in
Right.
other people's traps, and
Right.
then he steals a boat, and then he goes nutting and he ravages the street
Right.
for no reason.
Right.
Yet I had enough nuts for the last lifetime, and I
Right.
kept on just going. So there's a kind of weird openness to nature where he says it could also become really uncontrollable.
Yes.
So ecstatic doesn't just mean he's a nature poet the way
No.
he walks along the curated landscape.
No, this isn't like New Age.
No.
This isn't a kind of.
This isn't the walking tour of the Lake District.
No, this is not. And
And
yeah.
that wildness gets
Yeah.
lost, I think, in Wordsworth.
Definitely.
And
No, he gets pacified. I mean, he partly self-pacified, but
Right,
he,
well, that's
but he
what
gets
he's
but he
trying
gets
to-
but he gets pacified in reception, and it'll be like nice little pastoral scenes with birds, and actually he has figurations of violating plants, like super sexually violent images,
Right.
and he does want to think hard about what now some people would call negative affect, right? He wants to
Right.
think hard about desire and lawlessness, and yet he's not. There's still a sense of possible harmonies with the cosmos that I think keeps it under control in a way for him. I don't think this is a poet who fully goes down the full route of the possible nihilism of desire at all. I actually think that was held elsewhere in the blankness of possible mountain faces, the problems of divinity. I don't think that he found that. I think that's a kind of Satanism. In that period, they would have possibly call it. That was something that, say, Byron was much more alert to. There is a question of, is Wordsworth actually alert to the problem of evil?
It's interesting that you say that he's not open to the nihilism of desire. In both of your the three books, This Blue and then the Serial.
Maybe he is more than
you do talk. No, you talk quite a bit of being on the edge of something. That's a very funny poem, actually. That I won't read right now. It's a very sexual poem. It's very funny, I think. And you're sort of on the edge, and you're like, I didn't know what was beyond it. So yeah, I was on the edge, but I didn't know what an orgasm or something. It's a very funny poem because you say, but the nihilism of desire would be not memorable. We wouldn't know it even. We'd fall into it, as it were, sort of.
Right.
We would drop into it, and we would be completely engulfed in this ecstatic experience, and we wouldn't come back out with a memory of it. It would be traumatic in psychoanalytic terms.
Right.
So we would know. So you're saying, yeah, I'm on the edge, but I don't even know. I'm just going to say yes because probably, but if I were on the edge, I would no longer be on the edge. I would have fallen in.
Right.
Which is actually what Wordsworth, what you're saying, he probably doesn't have that, but it's there as a...
It's definitely there.
Because nature
yeah.
is also not tamed or benevolent. It's actually not what we want it to be, which is this great life-giving force.
He writes really interestingly about fear, too, and being afraid, and he has a sense of the sublime as something that is about forces which annihilate our minds, too. And I think he's really good on that, And so it's not all about, cheerful consciousness at all.
There's a passage, a stanza in your book, This Blue, which I heard something in Wordsworth in there, and you say, what I'm looking for is a golden bowl, carefully repaired, a complete world sealed along cracked lines. And there's something because in the prelude he says, our mind are nourished and invisibly repaired by this possibility of recollecting these intense feelings or emotions in tranquility. And sort of when you said, I'm looking for a golden bowl, a complete world sealed along cracked lines. That the world is not perfect, whole, but you want to have it whole along cracked lines, knowing that there are gaps, ruptures, blanks, etc. But knowing that would actually be a kind of solace or something. And for Wordsworth too, he says our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired, which is a very strange thing.
He has I think a much greater faith in this invisible reparation. I think that certainly than I do. And if elements of that appear in my work, it appears in the optative mode. It's something one is looking for.
I'm giving you the stanza in the middle of a poem.
Yeah, no, I know. And
it's
about a thing one might look for and hope for, but one does not assume. Whereas there's a lot of, especially in middle and older Wordsworth, where he asserts what in fact is in question. So the hymns to the healed mind, it's like maybe yes, maybe no. On that I'm agnostic. What I find in a way really moving about Wordsworth is the really serious effort to grapple with it, the really serious effort to grapple with broken minds and broken bonds, failed hopes. So I like him when he's more in his struggling modality than when he's in his affirmative modality, and that's also temperament. I'm going to I'm going to be happier with people who are who can tolerate negation and negativity than that. And but I do think there's something really just powerful and moving about how he really did try to encompass the kind of fault lines in ourselves and the fault lines between people and between what one might hope and what the world makes possible. And that is often something he's specifically addressing in the poetry. Now, does he prematurely rush in to have things be repaired or healable? Does he later on in his life write odes to duty? Does he? Yes, he does. He can be a real downer. Which
but maybe it comes out of the awareness that it isn't given. In some ways, to say when you're saying some of it, he wants it. He wants to believe in the repairability.
Yes.
We all do.
Of course.
I think we all do.
Yeah.
Is he taking a shortcut? Probably not. And this is actually, I think, what you just said.
Well, I agree with that.
The question is there, it would be probably insincere or ring kind of untrue or inauthentic if it was a shortcut, but he's doing the work to say, well, how would we get there?
Yeah.
So I think this is what is actually moving about Wordsworth. He takes it seriously, and if he took a shortcut somewhere and say, oh, and then I could gather myself and look at my memory and now I'm in the present and this is all. He said, no, there are fault lines. And what I'm trying to do is really be very attentive to these fault lines. And it's, I think also how I hear your question is sort of saying, do they make us deeper? Do they make us better? They're just what we experience. It's not totally given. It's sort of a Blakean question. Does experience make us more profound than innocence? I don't know.
Right. Right.
So I don't think he gives you that answer that the fault lines, the cracks in the wall are something we want to really forget and gloss over.
I don't think he does at all.
No, first of all, we can't.
That
all
actually
the poems open up.
Exactly. That's that is the material of a lot of the work. That is particularly in the prelude. But we're pivoting among a bunch of different areas.
But it seems to me this is a central concern of his other poems, as you said, where he maybe, and I wouldn't call them shortcuts, where maybe he's trying to do something else. There's also,
or that sense that he really wanted to write, or he had this whole plan of writing. The great philosophic poem. He was going to write The Recluse, and it's interesting because he never quite delivered on The Recluse, and what he's most known for at this point probably are a number of the shorter poems that are kind of astonishing and lodge in your ear, and these strange Lucy poems, these sort of supernatural poems. and then some of the lyrical ballads, some of which showed up in school books and schoolrooms, and then the prelude as this very long autobiographical epic. And so, you know, as one of the antechamber to the Recluse was this poem he published in 1814 called The Excursion, and it famously got this review that began, "This will never do." And, you know,
that's what one of his contemporaries said?
That's what Francis Jeffrey, this kind of fabulously cranky Scottish critic, this will never do. So,
whose name, let's just say that we do not remember, but we do remember Wordsworth.
Yes.
Just sort of for some poetic justice that actually this reviewer, what was his name, who said this will never do,
yeah, exactly.
largely forgotten outside of academia.
Yeah, but it is a good line, right? You know? If not, maybe
it's a good line, yes.
So,
and what did he see as a problem with that poem? With
I think you know, he and many others, they thought it was ponderous and labored and didn't take wing, and that things got so burdened with what Wordsworth wanted philosophically to deliver, that you know, that part of him that was didactic started displacing, you know, other slightly brightening elements, you know. So I think that, you know, they just, one of the things that's kind of fascinating about Wordsworth too is how much he courted the ludicrous. You know, he was willing to, he was, you know, and a lot of, you know, because he wrote these poems and lyrical ballads, a poem like, say, for example, The Idiot Boy, or, you know, these various poems, and other critics of his milieu and class were saying, this is actually idiotic and it's a form of slumming, and why are you writing about, you know, these sort of low customers? It's you know, it's a completely bogus move. This is not their diction, but it's mine. And so it's very interesting. He activated other people's resistance because he wanted to have these poems of cross-class social encounter. And he also, his whole theory of poetic diction and there should be a common language, Coleridge later on took him to task and said, look, Wordsworth is best when he's writing in his own voice. We don't want to hear Wordsworth, you know, all of his claims about writing in the selection of the language of rustics, i.e., you know, peasants or farm laborers, working class people. This is a really weird thing that Coleridge says. This is a really odd theory that, in fact, is inaccurate to Wordsworth's own practice. And you know, who cares about rustic language? Let's just do it in Wordsworth. You know, so he raised a lot of hackles in both some of his poems, and then he became, of course, this Victorian monument, and he was endlessly editing his own works. You know, he took a government position as the distributor of stamps and Wex.
He's like the Goethe of England. Who takes a government position, who endlessly edits his works, and to raise a lot of hackles with different things. And at the same time is assigned and if sort of if poor school children are afflicted with reading it. You know. What's today when you hear that kind of English, though, it's incredibly accessible. And so he did something to the English language that actually opened it up, probably in a way that high poetry could speak in this way.
I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, one of the lyrics, I wandered lonely as a cloud. And now that's not a thing you're probably going to hear, you know, walking down the Bowery, but that is still...
You will, first of all, hear it in every pop song ever written in the English language, of course.
Actually,
you will. Actually, you know, we always think there's a lot of wisdom contained in 3.5 minutes.
Exactly. And yet there's, he has a number of poems where it's not like you feel like you're teaching in translation, where often things from 1800 can feel like you are teaching. And of course you are teaching in different kinds of cultural translation, but the fact that he got taken up in schooling, and it's interesting to think of other poets in the period who were writing in this middle register of standard English, and so he's not the only one, but if you think the great poem by Thomas Gray, the ode, the churchyard, the elegy in a country churchyard, and it begins, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day." Now, that's probably a pretty esoteric line for us. We don't have a curfew bell tolling the knell of parting day, but it goes on in what for the period was a fairly general, accessible zone of a newly standardized English. He wasn't some of his other poems were much more ornate, with a much more elaborate diction, and they would have personifications marching along, and they would seem instantaneously hyperliterary and dated.
Okay.
And so some of Wordsworth still hits, some of Whitman can still hit a bandwidth of English, even though it'll still seem a little,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But the idea that one would write out of a potentially common idiom, that, I mean, you know, you could argue that people are writing Wordsworth all their lives and not knowing it, right? That
Right,
you know, theoretically,
so that stays
if
with
not,
us, right.
you know, and you know, there's a strong argument to be made, a counter argument, which is the kind of false tyranny of accessibility. It's like, so why should poetry be written in common language?
False tyranny of accessibility.
Yeah, it's like, so it's like just a, you know,
because
it's
accessibility also means a certain kind of value or standard, and
Yeah.
it sort of imposes that on.
I mean,
maybe
you
something
know,
that shouldn't be.
some people. I mean, some people
Also-
might want a poetry that is filled with, you know, weirdness and surreality and strange sonic effects, and so somebody like Wallace Stevens can
Right.
be filled with all this jingle jangle. It's like, what is he saying?
Right.
Whereas if you know, a lot of U.S. poetry is written in a kind of shared language as the realist novel.
I also think it's interesting when you said the false tyranny of accessibility. That's maybe a political concern,
Yes.
sociological concern. There's another issue when Wordsworth talks about having very deep experiences and then trying to assess what the meaning of those experiences is later, because they don't have an inherent meaning in some ways. Sometimes actually the reflection upon them allows him to say, what was the meaning of this to me? It's not the meaning came ready-made with its meaning.
Right.
It's
It's dynamic. It's
yeah,
created.
dynamic. And
It's-
by looking
yeah.
at 5 years ago, I was this person, now I'm that person, that is actually part of what the meaning is. It isn't just the meaning was there, now I can
Right.
grab it. That maybe I don't want a very deeply felt experience to be rendered into, because maybe that's not how I experienced it. Maybe
Right.
it was actually very particular and special. This is why when I go back to the poem I opened with, when you say, but now she's happy, incredulous in love, you don't want to translate this incredulity into accessible language that I can share with you, because part of it is it's not totally available to us.
Right.
So if poetry gives you the illusion, it all can be rendered into language and anybody can share, that's not what that experience was. So there's a certain sanctity to experience, or a certain preciousness, or trauma, whatever word you want to use. If it's always translatable into what everybody can understand, that's maybe not capturing that then.
I mean, that's, again, I think of, is it Wallace Stevens who says, the poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully.
Almost successfully, right.
And
Yes,
then, but there is something, I think the poet Susan Howe has talked about poems coming out of a silence, you know, or poetry coming out of a silence. And that sense of the kind of sanctity of the uncommunicable is, I actually think Wordsworth, he talks about underpresences, and for all of his really elaborate discursive dilation on all kinds of things, I think there is a sense of the irreducible, that and we all might have an experience of the irreducible, but we might not be able to fully communicate. We can index it, but we can't communicate it. And I do think I have clearly I have been a reader of Wordsworth in different keys for more than 25 years, and so it's interesting to reread Wordsworth, you know, and it's like, you know, 25 years have passed, 25 summers with a length of 25 winters, but there's a sense too that I mean, I have kind of profound and ramifying ambivalence about Wordsworth. I feel like, I mean, you know, and in a way, why not? I feel that way about a lot of poets who have mattered a lot to me. I can be both repelled.
Yeah, you have a whole book about that.
Yeah,
It's called My Poets. And it doesn't seem to be
I know, but I'm particularly ambivalent about Wordsworth.
Free zone. The other ones,
exactly.
You mean the other ones get sublimated into pleasure or joy?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Wordsworth is sort of, there's a lot of what now I would call in a kind of post-psychoanalytic, there's a lot of superego in Wordsworth, and there's not a lot of it seems, you know, and I mean, if you want to talk about the ratios, and again, it's not an accident that Keats diagnosed Wordsworth as sort of one afflicted with the egotistical sublime.
It's funny, when I reread it, I thought it was, because I read it first also, I don't know, 30 years ago, a long time ago, and I felt it was giving me hope that actually getting older is not such a despairing thing. That actually I thought, well, you know, you used to be so alive, and then of course we also know when you're young, you don't even know you're alive, all of that cliche. But I actually thought there was something kind of, and it didn't seem fake. It didn't seem he's selling me a bill of goods and saying, age and maturity and knowledge will give you abundant recompense. He actually thought, no, actually there's something else. You actually know the scope of experience.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take, it changes, it's not the same. But it's different and it could be good in a different way. So I actually thought there was something kind of hopeful that my ambivalence, I was kind of heartened by it and thought, and it's interesting when I reread Hartman, so the unremarkable Wordsworth and the first book, and then Bloom, and Bloom calls him a canonical poet, canonical memory in a chaotic age. We have no more orientations, and he says, but he gives us what we can remember. He is our Hermes, he's our guide to what we can remember. He said he establishes memory as a key in an age where there's no guidance. A really interesting kind of argument. And Bloom says, I misread Wordsworth when I was young, which Bloom says all the time.
Yeah,
because Bloom
that's
has been
interesting.
getting, you know, and so but in some ways I felt there was something heartening to say, oh, you getting older is not so terrible.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I actually think this points to something too, that that Wordsworth's writing is part of a kind of broader, what we might call a wisdom tradition. You know, I actually think it's part of a broader tradition, and one can feel coerced by that at times. One can also feel heartened by it, and I do think that he is a really tremendous poet of earned complexity. I do not think, at his best, I do not think he gives you, you know, shortcut consolations. I don't think, you know, and I find that very admirable, and also a kind of complex solace, you know. And part of it too is, well, it used to be uncontroversial that people went to poetry, you know, in Horatian terms, you know, to be delighted or instructed, and a lot of times, you know, if as Keats said about Milton, we resist those things that have a palpable design on us. You know, if we feel we're being hectored, right? It's like, oh no, but it's, you know, it's fine. You have the philosophic mind now that you're an adult, and you know how you have proportion, and you know how to place these experiences. So that can feel like a kind of disciplinary move, and other times it can be companionable. It can feel like, and so I often feel, I'm always just surprised when I reread Wordsworth, because I have different reactions. Sometimes I feel, oh my God, now we're going to have another hymn to the wind right after we got to a very difficult moment in something about, you know, the mother's death, or, you know, a farmer displaced from his land, and you can feel like there is something. He's going to make a kind of Wordsworthian move that's going to be annoying. And on the other hand, so I feel, no, this is really, there is a kind of profundity here that is earned and can be companionable. So really it depends on, you know, my own mood. I mean, he had a book, he called a book of his, which is hysterical, Moods of My Own Mind, I think, which I think is really, really funny, and also but also the seriousness of this, taking moods seriously, right? As a kind of fabulous romantic, psychological, philosophical commitment. So I think he's interesting in that key. as well.
But I like it as a kind of companion.
Yeah.
That there can be ambivalence, but you
Yeah.
say he's going through it with you.
Yeah.
It's a nice way. Okay. Thank you very much,
Thank
Maureen.
you.
I really, I'm going to look for the hymn to the wind now after this. So I really want to thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for
and I hope
having
to have you
me.
back on for another one of your poets.
Oh, that'd be.
There's a whole list.
Well, you got a lot of little windows into some
great.
of them. But
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. Okay, great.